Dear learners, we are happy to welcome you to the first panel discussion on political science and international relations. Today we discuss some of the important topics, and today we have with us Professor Jayadev Uyangada from Columbia University and Mr. Sunil Bastian. And we are going to discuss three important topics which we are discussing two in our syllabi, and these topics include devolution, political participation and social movements. First, let me introduce our panelists today. Professor Jayadev Uyangada is Professor of Political Science at the University of Colombo and one of the foremost political scientists in Sri Lanka, who has researched and published extensively on ethnic conflict, conflict resolution, democracy, devolution, etc. We are also proud to say that Professor Jayadev Uyangada also has worked as visiting Professor of Political Science at the Open University of Sri Lanka, and he has contributed immensely to develop the politics and international studies stream of the social studies department. His name is, I think, very much familiar to you as it appears in almost all of our textbooks as chairperson, author or editor. Mr. Sunil Bastian too is a well-known researcher and an intellectual. He has immensely published locally and internationally. He has worked as a researcher for several research institutes in Sri Lanka and abroad. His research work has mainly focused on political economy, devolution, democracy and ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. And we warmly welcome both Professor Jayadev Uyangada and Mr. Sunil Bastian for this program, and we are indeed privileged to have you sirs today with us. So let's move on to our discussion. And I would like to start the discussion with the concept of devolution. And I know Professor Jayadev Uyangada has worked much on this field on devolution of political power in Sri Lanka. And so I will start the discussion with you, sir. Sir, we'll start with the concept of devolution. And how would you like to define the concept of devolution, and how has it been defined in the field of political science or in international relations?
Well, the concept of devolution came to Sri Lanka's political debate and discussions only in the early and mid-1980s. The meaning of the concept in political theory refers to the transfer of certain powers exercised by the central government to other units of power that are outside the central government. It can be provinces or regions. Now, the notion of devolution is something in between federalism and decentralization. And we know that there are varieties of constitutions that define the framework of the states. First, we have the unitary model of the state, where the powers of the state are concentrated and centralized in one center of power. Those powers include legislative, executive and judicial powers. In the federal system, you have a model of the state where the central government and federal units share those three areas of power: legislative, executive and judicial powers. The devolution is somewhere in between, at least in Sri Lankan experience. Now, the Sri Lanka is a case where devolution was introduced in 1987 without changing the constitutional doctrine that Sri Lanka was a unitary state. So, Sri Lanka is at present, after 1987's 13th Amendment, is neither a unitary state nor a federal state, but something in between. So, we can say that what we have in Sri Lanka is a state defined by the concept of devolution. So, once again, the devolution refers to the idea that the central government, some of the central government's powers are transferred voluntarily by the central government to the units in the periphery, It can be provincial councils, it can be states, even it can be some district-based councils.
Yeah, since we started with the devolution process of Sri Lanka, Professor Jayadev Younger was referring to that. I would like to ask Mr. Bastian, and when did in Sri Lanka devolution really take place first? I mean, what was the trigger for?
Yeah, I think as we had also said, in Sri Lanka there have been fundamentally two kinds of debates. There have been a long-standing debate on decentralization, which is often linked to development, which very much there. It has a very, very long history. But the idea of devolution came primarily because of what is called an ethnic issue, but basically trying to form a structure of a state where people with multiple identity groups could live together. And it is not surprising, although there were earlier, even before independence, some demanded kind of a quasi-federal system. But it is within the problem of Tamil people who asked for a separate state in the 1970s. It is around that political issue the whole devolved structures have been set up. That is 13th Amendment. But I also must kind of remind that it is only about last year, although we had structures, we had laws and all that, but if I call northern province kind of heartland of Tamil politics, it was only 2011 we had elections and a body came, elected representatives of Tamil people came into the northern provincial councils. So although we have passed the laws, politics has been as such. What really is we were looking for a solution to the whole issue of a multi-ethnic society. It is only very recently we even have an elected body. So we are an amazing situation where there is a highest degree of centralization on one side happening, but we have some kind of a devolved powers.
Well, we inherited a very centralized political system from the colonial masters of the British.
Oh yes.
And Tracy Layton argues in her book Political Integration Through Decentralization and Devolution of Power that in relation to Sri Lanka, it should be noted that the issue of decentralization and devolution of power has been the subject since 1948. So these concepts, decentralization and devolution, are they the same concept, or whether there is any difference between these concepts?
No, they are certainly. I mean, I see Sri Lankan state formation, modern state formation, certainly began during the colonial period. But as many countries, post-colonial countries, elite who inherited power defended what colonial masters gave us, right? In a funny way, if you look at single nationalist politics has become the biggest defenders of the whole idea of centralized state that came from the colonial period. Yeah, there are nuances in our debate now. If you look at now, at current, there are municipal councils and urban councils, which is the oldest institutions, and there's a long history, ideas behind that institution. Then we had decentralization demand for decentralization after independence. There's a long history. I think the high point that was the DDCs that were formed in 1981. So that also coexists. So in a way, these are all attempts to reform the state, but coming from different politics, coming from different political currents. So that's what we have today. Yes, you are correct in the sense these ideas you can trace back to before independence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's a bit of a point I want to make here. There are many countries we blame the colonial period for all these things. But if you look at all over the world, elite who took over power from the colonial masters championed those same ideas and defended those same ideas. There's a brilliant book about, say, African states, how all these structures that came from the colonial period defended by the post-colonial elite.
Yeah, well, Mr. Bastian again, and apart from ethnic conflict, was development never a cause for development?
Definitely.
Yeah.
This is where if you look at history of decentralization, after 71, both these reforms of the state structures came. If you look at our history, when the state was challenged through violent politics, basically. See, I think in the post-colonial state, managing state-society relations, Sri Lanka, there were two important dimensions. One, electoral politics, which got established. Second, what came to be called the welfare state. But it was early 70s, we saw the first sign how that formula is not working, right? First insurgency happened at that time. When that happened, our response to that insurgency was development. We interpreted it as a failure of development. So there were a whole lot of projects, whole lot of issues, land reform, some of the education reform, and decentralization.
So you clearly see a distinction between the devolution process of 1980s and before that.
Yeah, definitely.
So how do you, explain?
The big difference is what we had mentioned. With regard to Tamil politics demand always has been an autonomous unit that have legislative power. Earlier it was federalism. That was, but the demand from the south was very much more decentralization, so as to make development more successful. These are two different discourses, right? Sometimes I think in the discussion we put these things in some kind of a continuum without understanding the diverse politics of that. There are links at the same time, but at the same time I look at this as two distinct currents.
Yeah, anyway, the dominant factor has been ethnic conflict.
Definitely. For me, devolution have been dominant. That's why I still argue, although we have had a provincial council system all these years, right? And also there are a lot of studies showing how ineffective some were, because the provincial councils was not there in the core area from where this demand came from.
Yeah, with that point, I would like to again come to Professor Uyangwood. Right, in 87, with the intervention of India, so Sri Lanka happened to accept provincial councils as a way of devolving power to the periphery or to the conflict area. So there is this notion, especially strongly among nationalist ideologues, that devolution has challenged the supremacy of the constitution or the unitary character of the state. So how do you view this?
Well, devolution challenged the unitary character of the state, which is correct. Actually, devolution is a form of state in which some of the powers of the central government are transferred to peripheral units. It's a system of power sharing, whereas a unitary state is a system of centralization of power. So in any political model in which political power is shared between the central government and peripheral units, it is a significant structural deviation from the unitary model. Yeah. In that sense, yes, devolution challenges the unitary character of the state. Secondly, when we look at the 13th Amendment, which brought devolution to Sri Lanka, you can see a compromise between the unitary clause of the constitution and the power sharing features of devolution. Now, when the 13th amendment was introduced in 1987, the unitary clause of the 1978 constitution was not altered. But the 13th Amendment introduced a system of power sharing between the central government and the peripheral units called provincial councils. Now, there is a very interesting parallel with India. Now, the Indian constitution does not say that India is a federal state, but India is a federal state.
But Rajini Kothari argues it's a quasi-federal system.
Yeah, it's India. Well, some people say it's a quasi-federal system because it has more powers to the center. Yeah. But that's in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah. Now, Indian constitution has changed quite significantly, and constitution and political practices as well. But the parallel with Sri Lanka is that we have a model of the state which constitutionally is a compromise between the unitary model and the federal model. So that's the, I think, the most important, significant constitutional nature of the Sri Lankan state at the moment.
But why there is so much apathy toward this idea of federalism or devolving power? So I don't think it's still that idea has been materialized. We have really devolved power. Because
well, it's more than apathy. There's also been resistance. You know, if you look at the whole history of devolution, and also the political debate on devolution, as Sunil mentioned, there have been two fundamentally contradictory approaches to the question of the Sri Lankan state. One model or one approach talked about the continuation of the colonial state with centralized features. And it is in that model that people also talked about decentralization. Now, decentralization merely decentralizes administrative power of the government, not political, executive or judicial powers. But there was another kind of a, alternative argument for the Sri Lankan state. That was the federal argument developed by the Federal Party since the 1950s. So these two visions of Sri Lanka's post-independent state presented actually two opposing perspectives. One for the continuation of the unitary model. The other is a structural reworking of the unitary model in order to facilitate a federal model. So the political reality is also that the federal argument emerged from the Tamil community, which was an ethnic minority, and the unitary argument is part of the Sinhala majority nationalist politics. So the argument for state reform was also polarized along ethnic lines. Because of this ethnic entry to the political debate, the question of legitimacy or popular acceptance of the devolution model or federal model was under serious actually challenge. So there was, at one level, there was a political resistance in the sense of ethnic politics. And there was also another reason why there has been resistance to devolution. That's, the Sri Lanka's political culture has been modeled along a vision of a centralized power structure. You see, even after the 13th Amendment in 1987, there was so much resistance by politicians, by bureaucrats to devolve powers to the provincial councils. And I think Sunil and I did some studies on that, and it was amazing that politicians were very reluctant to devolve powers that were under their ministries and departments to the provincial council ministries, although the constitution said that these powers should be transferred. And so were the bureaucrats. Bureaucrats continuously resisted. So what we had in Sri Lanka is a situation where constitutionally it was made compulsory and necessary for certain powers enjoyed by the central government to be transferred to the periphery, but there was resistance. That's because of the idea that the centralized state is the most suitable political order for Sri Lanka. So these are some of the structural constraints. There was also a third point. Actually, the popular argument for any form of political devolution came only from the ethnic minorities, not from the singular majority society. That's why some people still argue that provincial council system is something that Sinhalese people never wanted but imposed on them. So in the absence of an argument, popular argument for devolution in the Sinhalese society, initially there was difficulty for the provincial council system to gain any significant degree of public support. But what has happened over the past 3 decades is that there is a greater degree of acceptance of devolution as necessary for Sri Lanka. At the same time, there is also popular discontent about devolution and provincial council system because provincial council system has not been allowed to function properly. And that's why some people say it's a white elephant.
Yeah, with this we can come to actually, I mean, for political science students, it will be very important if we can deal a little bit on the relation between executive presidency and the provincial council system. So, Mr. Sunil Bastian, can you?
Yeah. Now, this is you see, for me, the executive presidency came in Sri Lanka with due to another dimension of our state. That is if you look at Mr. J.R. Javasan's ideas about a presidential system, actually he first talked about the presidential system in the 1960s. He was the only politician who seriously talked about a presidential system. His argument for presidential system was for economic reforms. He argued need for a centralized, another independently elected president who can take unpopular reforms which are needed for economic reform. So when 13th Amendment, the presidency was already there. That's why I say one of the main reasons why even the provincial system can't work now is we have a highly central, especially as a political economist for me now. If you look at the economic side, if you look at the side that is on the economic life of people, a lot of decisions are taken at the center, not by the periphery, right? So periphery end up with actually managing certain facilities like school system, but the new investment for schools has to come from the central budget. So we have this coexistence of a system where there's a high degree of centralization due to the presidential system and provincial system which emerged out of finding a solution for the minority issue. Now, you must remember there's another, just one point I like to make. In Sri Lankan discussion, the states are often treated as very static element. The states are kind of formed and it doesn't change, right? But if you look at history of state formation, that's my current interest, history of state formation, especially in a global context, you see a huge variations happening. Even in the current context, if you look at, I mean, just one point to just remind, British state was now just voted a few months ago on a separation of Scotland. So you can see how states evolve. States are, I think this is one of the important things to transfer to somebody who is studying history of political phenomena. And Sri Lanka is a case where this history has created this number of institutions. Now, presidency on one hand, there is a provincial council on the other side, then there's another sub-district unit, divisional secretariat, then there's a Pradeshia Sabha,
local governments, yes.
Municipal council. You go to the field and try to do work on this whole setup, you will see a multiple layers.
Yeah, I think this is where some of these strong arguments against devolution of power to the provincial councils comes, because we have a strong administrative system. Or previously we used to have Gam Sabha or village councils or district development council. So all these, I mean, when you look at the history, all these things came, I mean, as a response to the demands of development or ethnic conflict.
You see, when you look at the history of Sri Lankan state, the pre-colonial state was very much a decentralized state. Right? Not only occasionally pre-colonial Sri Lankan state could develop itself as a centralized state. So decentralization of a part of Sri Lanka's political tradition actually, which a lot of people do not seem to be able to acknowledge. But the response to your previous question is that when we evaluate the performance of devolution in Sri Lanka during the past 30 years, we must also place it in the context of what Sunil said as the centralization of the state. So for any student of political science, there's a very interesting paradox, very interesting dilemma here. That's, can devolution work in a context of increasing centralization of state power under the same constitution? Actually, Sri Lanka's devolution has not been able to successfully resolve this dilemma.
Yeah. Well, now I think we have much referred to Sri Lankan context, and I would like to come to Mr. Sunil Bastian. I think you have a lot of observations and experience on the international scenario of devolution. How can you just share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I want to make a very small point, right? In the international system, after Second World War, a system of state got consolidated, right? Don't forget, states always get consolidated by an international system. These are two sides of the same coin. States don't exist outside the international system. But 1945, we had a system whereby this state system got consolidated. I think for me, one of the biggest now, starting from late 80s, with the collapse of what I call the state socialist system, right? Up to that point, actually, there were only, I think, 2 occasions where the state boundaries changed. Probably Bangladesh is one, and there was something else somewhere. But if you look at that after 89, a lot of people forget, after the collapse of the state social system, 15 new states were created. There was one Soviet Union, there are 16 states actually. Then you take Yugoslavia, right? Then of course South Sudan and all that. And if you look at all the European countries are very interesting. There's a brilliant book called Vanishing Kingdoms, which shows the history of state structures in Europe. And some of these have been changing, some of these have been with one side or the other. And the latest, most interesting thing is Britain, one of the oldest states, which Scotland became, I think, in 1707 or something. Now,
and can you take EU as the best model of devolution at the international level? At a very,
no,
very
that's
macro level?
I think the global system, if you are looking at global system, you have to talk at different level. There are systems that cuts across states. That has become a reality. EU is one of those. But the states also remain, right? But these states are not, as I always argue, these are historical constructs. These are not structures that doesn't change. And for me, I am seeing a situation where globally, where these trends are very strong now. These trends are, of course, a lot of political economists even would argue there are lots of other global processes which cuts across this state. So we are in a fairly complex kind of world now. But unfortunately, our idea of state, which is come from after 45, we are still stuck there, I think.
Yeah, I think we are in the middle of a very interesting discussion on devolution, especially referring to Sri Lankan context. But our time is very limited, and to end this discussion, I would like to refer to Professor Uyangode. And now in Sri Lanka, there is a lot of debate, argument on changing the constitution. And how would proposed constitution affect the provincial council system or the existing devolution mechanism in Sri Lanka?
Actually, there has been something like a consensus over the past several years that the 13th Amendment should stay. But there was also an argument to go beyond the 13th Amendment or to reduce the powers of the Provincial Council given the 13th Amendment. I don't think there is a political agreement on that, either to go beyond the 13th Amendment or to bring the 13th Amendment further down. So my feeling is that in the constitutional debate, there would not be a strong argument to do away with the Provincial Council system, because all the political parties, despite the rhetoric, have come to accept the Provincial Council system as a political and constitutional reality.
Yeah. Now, I think we had a very interesting discussion on devolution, and still we can go on and discuss many aspects of this concept. But I would like to conclude this discussion, and students can download our discussion, and it will be available as a digital archive. And I would like to thank Professor Uyangode and Mr. Bastian for their very much appreciated participation, and we are extremely privileged to have research. Thank you very much.